Hare Krishna. On November 6, 1556, the day after the Battle of Panipat, when Hemu was brought before Akbar, wounded and semi-conscious, Akbar smote Hemu on the neck with his scimitar, says Smith. Akbar was then just about 14 years of age. Even from that young age, he gloried in the cowardly killing of helpless and prostrate enemies. Such was his upbringing. Vincent Smith says in page 30 that, quote, after the Battle of Panipat, Akbar's victorious forces marched straight to Delhi, which opened its gates to Akbar, who made his entry in state. Agra also passed into his possession. In accordance with the ghastly custom of the times, a tower was built with the heads of the slain. Immense treasures were taken with the family of Hemu, whose aged father was executed. Unquote. In suppressing Khan Jaman's revolt, his confidant Muhammad Miraq, says Smith, quote, was tortured for 5 successive days on the execution ground. Each day he was trussed up in a wooden frame and placed before one of the elephants. The elephant caught him in his trunk and squeezed him and flung him from one side to the other. Abul Fazl relates this horrid barbarity without a word of censure. Unquote. After the capture of Chittor, Smith again says, quote, Akbar, exasperated by the obstinate resistance offered to his army, created the garrison and town with merciless severity. The emperor ordered a general massacre, which resulted in the death of 30,000. Many were made prisoners. Unquote. The greatest indictment of Akbar is perhaps presented by the great historian Todd's remark that, quote, in Chittor, the emperor's proceedings were marked by the most illiterate atrocities. Unquote. In November 1572 AD, when Akbar defeated and captured the Ahmedabad ruler Muzaffar Shah, he ordered his opponents to be trampled to death by elephants. Hamzawan, a military commandant, was barbarously punished by Akbar by the excision of his tongue. In 1573, Masud Hussain Mirza, a near relation of Akbar, who had risen in revolt, had his eyes swept off after capture. His other 300 supporters were drawn up before Akbar with the skins of asses, hogs, and dogs drawn over their faces. Some of them were executed with various ingenious tortures. It is disgusting to find a man like Akbar sanctioning such barbarities which he inherited from his Tatar ancestors, says Smith. When Mirza was defeated in the Battle of Ahmedabad, September 2, 1573, a pyramid was built with the heads of the rebels, more than 2,000 in number. When the ruler of Bengal, Daud Khan, was defeated following the barbarous custom of the times, Akbar's commander Munim Khan massacred his prisoners, whose heads were sufficiently numerous to furnish 8 sky-high minarets. When Daud, overcome with thirst, asked for water, they filled his slipper with water and brought it to him. This is mentioned in Akbarnama, volume 3, page number 180. These instances should suffice to convince the readers that Akbar's whole reign is a continuous tale of horrid cruelties. Smith's account of Akbar's reign contains numerous instances of Akbar's perfidy. On page 57, he says, quote, an extraordinary incident which occurred in April while the royal camp was at Thaneswar, the famous Hindu place of pilgrimage to the north of Delhi throw a rather unpleasant light upon Akbar's character. Now Smith says, quote, "The sannyasis assembled at the Holy Bank were divided into two parties called the Kurs and Puris. The leader of the Puris complained to the king that the Kurs had unjustly occupied the accustomed sitting place of the Puris, who were thus debarred from collecting the pilgrims' alms." Unquote. They were asked to decide the issue by mortal combat. They were drawn up on either side with their arms drawn. In the fight that ensued, the combatants used swords, bows, and arrows and stones. Akbar, seeing that Puris were outnumbered, gave the signal to some of his more savage followers to help the weaker party. This was something worse than the Aesop's fable of the two quarreling cats approaching a monkey to divide between them a lump of cheese. In this fight between the two Hindu sannyasi sects, Akbar saw to it that both were ultimately annihilated by his own fierce soldiers. The chronicler unctuously adds that Akbar was highly delighted with this sport. Remarks Smith. At Battle of Haldighat, when Akbar's forces were ranged against Rana Pratap's, it was mainly a fight between Rajput versus Rajput, because Akbar, by his demoralizing atrocities, had terrified a number of Rajput chiefs into submission, and through them sought to subdue the proudest of the clan, Rana Pratap. At a time when the sides were locked in battle and it was not easy to distinguish between Rajputs allied with Akbar and those opposing him, Badayuni, fighting on Akbar's side, asked Akbar's commander where to shoot so that he may hit only the enemy. The commander replied, it did not matter. He could merely shoot in the midst of the Rajput armies, and whoever was killed, it was a gain to Islam. With that assurance, says Badayuni, he had no difficulty and he started shooting with gay abandon, secure in the belief that no precautions were necessary. After the capture of Chittor, says Colonel Todd, quote, Akbar defaced every monument that had been spared by the earlier conquerors. Akbar was long ranked with Sahabuddin, Alauddin and other instruments of destruction and with every just claim. And like this, he constructed a mimbar, means a pulpit or reading desk in a mosque for the Quran, from the deity of Ekling, the hereditary god of the Rajputs. Unquote. This gives the lie to the assiduously fostered view that Akbar was tolerant towards the Hindus and respected their deities. Todd continues, quote, in or about AD 1603, Akbar, who was used to retire to his room in the afternoon for rest, happened to emerge earlier than was expected, and at first he could not find any of the servants. When he came near the throne and couch, he saw a helpless lamplighter coiled up in sleep close to the royal couch. Enraged at the sight, Akbar ordered him to be thrown from the tower, and he was dashed into 1,000 pieces. Unquote. On page 145 and 146, Vincent Smith observes, quote, Akbar's policy with regard to the Portuguese was torturous and perfidious. At the very moment when missionaries were approaching his court, in response to the friendly invitation, he had organized an army to capture the European ports. The Jesuit fathers were disgusted at the clear evidence of the duplicity of Akbar, who pretended a desire for friendship while actually ordering hostilities. Unquote. In August 1600, when Akbar's forces besieged Asrigarh fought but had no hope of victory. Vincent Smith says, quote, Akbar resolved to rely on those arts of intrigue and guile in which he excelled. He therefore invited King Miran Bahadur of Asrigarh to come out for an interview, swearing on his own royal head that the visitor would be allowed to return in peace. Miran Bahadur accordingly came out wearing a scarf in a way signifying submission. Akbar sitting motionless as a statue, as Miran Bahadur did reverence thrice and was advancing. A Mughal officer caught him by the head and threw him down, forcing him to perform complete prostration, a ceremony on which Akbar laid much stress. He was held in custody and asked to send an order in writing to the fort commandant to surrender. The latter refused to surrender and sent his son to ask for the king's release. The youth asked whether his father was willing to surrender. The fort gave a spirited retort, on which he was stabbed. The fort commander informed that his son had been done to death, addressing the garrison to defend the fort to the last man, strangulated himself with a scarf. This instance will prove that nothing was too mean for Akbar and that his perfidy could stoop to abysmal depths. Unquote. Lust for wealth, women, territory and power was the chief motive for Akbar's conquest, exactly like modern Indian political leaders, the political prostitutes. They have perhaps learned it from Akbar. In the Ranthambore Treaty, we have seen that the vanquished were always compelled to surrender their women to Akbar. In connection with Akbar's campaign against Baj Bahadur, we have already observed that Akbar's lust for women made him overtake Adham Khan by forced marches all the way from Agra to make him surrender all the women from Baj Bahadur's harem that the latter had misappropriated for himself. With regard to Akbar's campaign against Bundelkhand's Rani Durgavati, Smith wells in page 50 that, quote, Akbar's attack on a princess of a character so noble was mere aggression, wholly unprovoked and devoid of all justification, other than the lust for conquest and plunder. Akbar's annexions were the result of ordinary kingly ambition, supported by adequate power. The attack, devoid of moral justification, on the excellent government of Rani Durgavati was made on the principles which determined the subsequent annexions of Kashmir, Ahmednagar and other kingdoms. Akbar felt no scruples about initiating a war, and once he had begun a quarrel, he hit hard without mercy. His proceedings were much the same as those of other able ambitious kings. Unquote. Describing Akbar's wanton attack against Rana Pratap of Mewar, Smith remarks in page 107, quote, It is not necessary to adduce any particular incident as supplying a motive for the attack on the Rana. The campaign of 1576 was intended to destroy the Rana and crush finally his pretensions to stand outside of the empire. The emperor desired the death of the Rana and the absorption of his territory. Unquote. A proper understanding of the struggle between Rana Pratap and Akbar should by itself be enough for any judicious observer to condemn Akbar as a rank aggrandizer, since the two were working at cross purposes and were opposed to each other in deadly combat. A student of history cannot escape the responsibility of adjudging one of them as representing the forces of injustice, tyranny and repression, since Rana Pratap was a son of the soil fighting against unprovoked aggression. It automatically follows that Akbar must be charged with wanton manslaughter and other crimes in attacking principality after principality. And yet, curiously enough, Bharatiya history is heavily loaded with Akbar's eulogies, representing him almost as an angel. One of the sinister fictions foisted on Bharatiya history is that Akbar's angelic goodness is proved by his founding of a world order called Din-e-Ilahi. This is a complete perversion of truth. Akbar's haughtiness and ambition had reached such a pitch that he could not tolerate people doing obeisance to mullahs and priests in the name of religion. Akbar asserted that he was divinity himself, the highest temporal and spiritual authority, and that on no account must people pay respects to any other person. Akbar's insistence was therefore a negation of all religion and an attempt to appropriate to himself unbridled and unrestrained power over the destinies of men and women. To that end, Akbar compelled his subjects to greet each other with the term Allahu Akbar, which interpreted one way meant God is great, but in the more subtle sense intended by Akbar meant that Akbar himself is Allah. Smith explains in page 127 that, quote, the use of the ambiguous phrase Allahu Akbar gave color to the most extreme criticisms. Even Abul Fazl admits that the innovation aroused much uneasy feeling. At times, Akbar allowed himself the fancy that in his own person he had bridged the gulf between the finite and the infinite. Unquote. Father Montserrat, describing his mission's failure, wrote in sadness of heart, quote, it may be suspected that Jalaluddin means Akbar, was moved to summon the Christian priest not by any divine inspiration but by a certain curiosity or a design to devise something new for the destruction of souls. Unquote. On page 125, Smith describes how the Bible the Jesuits had presented to Akbar. He returned to them at a much later date. Smith says, quote, the truth is that Akbar's presented religion consists essentially in the assertion of his personal supremacy over things spiritual as well as things temporal. The 4 degrees of devotion to His Majesty consisted of readiness to sacrifice property, life, honor, and religion. Notwithstanding the fine phrases about general tolerance, which occupies so large a space in the writings of Abul Fazl and the sayings of Akbar, many acts of fierce intolerance were committed. Unquote. About Akbar's political sham religion, Smith remarks, quote, the whole scheme was the outcome of ridiculous vanity, a monstrous growth of unrestrained autocracy. Unquote. Xavier, a Jesuit at Akbar's court, gives a typical instance of Akbar's perfidy in making people drink water in which his feet had been washed. Xavier writes, Smith says, page 189, quote, Akbar posed as a prophet, wishing it to be understood that he works miracles through healing the sick by means of the water in which he washed his feet. Unquote. A footnote on the same page quotes a contemporary chronicler Badayuni to say that this special type of humiliation was particularly reserved by Akbar only for Hindus. Badayuni says, quote, if other than Hindus came and wished to become disciples at any sacrifice, His Majesty reproved them, unquote. Women in abject misery and sheer desperation, subjected to rape, plunder and torture, used to approach Akbar as a last resort, laying their children at his feet and begging for mercy. Repression in several forms being daily routine, as observed earlier, there always used to be a crowd of women and children at Akbar's court gate, but wily nobles interpreted this to the Jesuits at Akbar's court as they are coming to seek Akbar's blessings as a high priest. Blessings, of course, they certainly shout, but not in the sense in which it has been cunningly interpreted. The women and children shout some relief from hellish torture and tyranny let loose on them. Akbar's having married many Rajput women is often trotted out as a glorified instance of his spirit of so-called conciliation and tolerance. This is adding insult to injury and putting a premium on lechery. It has been amply illustrated here that Akbar considered his entire realm as a huge harem and that he sought the women of all he vanquished through coercion and compulsion. That was one of his devices to make the humiliation of his victims complete. Dragging Hindu women into their harems had been a pernicious tradition with all invaders. Akbar, for several reasons, had a penchant for it. To parade it as a special virtue is therefore the height of perversity, hypocrisy and casuistry that pervades Bharatiya history. Did Akbar ever give a single woman of his household in marriage to a Hindu? A $1 billion question to be asked to the modern Indian political prostitutes who say the DNA of Hindu and Muslim is same on you. Har Har Mahadev. Please watch the part 3.